Conference, the next Conservative government will abolish stamp duty on your home.
The Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, has announced loads of new policies here at the party's conference in Manchester. Is it enough to win over voters and also win over her own party so she can keep her job? We will discuss all of that on this latest episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Henry and Chris, hello.
Hello. Hi.
So what we were listening to this morning for about 45 minutes at 11:15 was Kemi Badenoch doing her first ever party conference speech as Conservative Party leader. So where do you want to begin?
Well, I think there's a reasonable case to be made. That was her best moment as Conservative Party leader. She hasn't, frankly, had a good 11 months or whatever it is as Tory leader. I think that's widely acknowledged even by those who backed her then and now. But I think this has been a successful conference for her, culminating in a speech which was everything Chris said, confidently delivered, but also sharpened, I think, for the first time, what had been really quite blurry, which is what exactly it was that she stood for and what exactly it was that a Conservative government led by Kemi Badenoch would do for the country. Now, I suspect there's now going to be a wild Westminster overcorrection and people are going to say Kemi Badenoch is wonderful and it's all going swimmingly. Transparently, it's not. The most successful party in the history of the democratic world is at its least successful ebb ever. But if anything was going to begin turning that around, it required at least a very good conference speech, and she's delivered that.
What was so interesting, chatting to people afterwards who worked with Kemi Badenoch and like her, they were sort of relieved that she got through party conference and it was sort of better than bad and better than okay. It wasn't about like, oh, yeah, we're opening up an amazing conversation with the country. Actually, we're on course to like reverse the decline and maybe even win the next election. There was none of that. It was just like, oh, actually, we've sort of stabilised her leadership in an okay place.
Yeah, the phrase I've heard from a few within the party who are deeply worried about where they are and have been sceptical about Kemi Badenoch's capacity to be the sort of agent of their revival is that they were pleasantly surprised. That's a phrase I've heard a couple of times in the last hour or so. Not just about Kemi Badenoch's speech, but the nature of the last few days. And I think two things. One is the sort of macro point, which is trying to make an argument about where they think they can be distinctive within the political discussion, not least on the economy. And what's interesting, actually, despite all of the kerfuffle and row around Liz Truss, and as we were discussing, I think on the last episode, Adam, the reality that Labour and others will still be using the words Liz and Truss probably in a quarter of a century, let alone in the next couple of months and years. Despite that, there is some polling evidence to suggest that there is something there's a logic in them pursuing an argument around the economy and being seen to be, they hope, the sort of purveyors of sound public money, and then hanging off that, this blitz of policies that they hope, at least some of them, are quite retail in their offer, that people can notice in a more micro sort of sense.
And here's the big dramatic policy that Kemi Badenoch unveiled right at the end of her speech. It was actually quite a good little bit of speech writing and kind of theatre building in the room, actually, because people were excited to see what she was going to say.
And it hadn't leaked.
Yeah,
so we were waiting for it.
Yeah, and this is what she announced.
Conference, stamp duty is a bad tax. It is an unconservative tax. The last Conservative government cut stamp duty for thousands of home buyers. But now we must go further. We must free up our housing market because a society where no one can afford to buy or move is a society where social mobility is dead. So I have looked at the stamp duty thresholds to see where we can change them. I have looked at the rates you have to pay to see if we can lower them. I have decided that we can't, because that simply wouldn't be enough. Conference, the next Conservative government will abolish stamp duty on your home.
So, Henry, let's do the sort of the T's and C's of this policy. First of all, this does not apply in Scotland and Wales because, well, actually the big T and C is you need to have a Conservative government and they'd won the election to be able to implement it. That's the biggest T and C of all. But then when you drill into it, this is England and Northern Ireland because in Scotland and Wales it's devolved.
That's right, though the Conservatives are saying they'd encourage the devolved governments of Scotland and Wales to abolish their equivalents, but yes, absolutely. And there's some other caveats around this only applying to UK-based purchasers who are not buying it as a company, and also it would only be for primary residences.
So not for second homes.
Exactly. So there's some caveats there. But look, I think you're right to say the biggest caveat is it would require a Conservative government. Clearly, we are probably 3.5 years away from a general election, and who knows what the economic situation of the country will be then. So I think this is best understood not as an sort of immediate offer to a public which is about to go to the polls, but as a statement of values and priorities. And I think it's a very clear one, and it's also a very intelligible one. I mean, that's the thing. You think of big party conference speeches, big party conference policies, and sometimes you think, okay, I kind of understand that, but you have to have, even as a journalist, the sort of 20-minute briefing afterwards to truly understand what it means. This doesn't have any of that. Abolish stamp duty. Lots of people will know what that means. I'm conscious there are lots of people, and this is partly what the policy is designed to address, who have never come close to home ownership, especially younger people, and they might not know. But generally, people will know what it means. And one interesting point, like a lot of the policies the Conservatives have had this week, it's targeted at younger voters. And by younger in the Conservative context, I mean non-pensioners.
Yes.
But that is what they know. They have a massive demographic problem that they need to address.
Because, so some other sort of caveats to this. I mean, obviously, it doesn't apply if you're buying a property that doesn't have any stamp duty on it. So
Right.
if the flat or the house you're buying is less than £125,000, well, you already don't have to pay any stamp duty on that. And then I was just reading, because the Institute for Fiscal Studies, they've been banging on about how awful stamp duty is for years. And they're saying that a third of the revenue that is raised for stamp duty every year comes from properties worth more than £1 million. So if you're talking about who this is cutting taxes for, it's for people buying expensive houses. Not people buying a house at all.
They make the argument that not only is it in line with their broader, if you like, political brand, but they think, well, I came from a briefing actually with some of Kemi Badenoch's team. They say, look, you'll never find a consensus among economists about a quote-unquote bad tax, but their argument is that this is the closest you will get to a economist saying, look, this tax gets in the way.
Because it stops people moving house.
Frictional task. It puts people off moving house. So the idea is that it would instantly increase supply because there'd be a more fluidity of movement, that there'd be a more efficient use of the existing housing stock. So, for instance, people, perhaps older people who choose to downsize but then decide not to because they're going to get whacked with stamp duty might be more inclined to do that. But what's interesting from the briefing I just came from is that, and again, as you say, insert all the T's and C's, the next election's miles off, and they've got to win it, which is two huge hurdles for them right now. But they weren't instantly committing to doing it straight away.
Right.
Which then prompted the question from us lot as reporters, well, if you don't do it straight away, nobody's going to move house because the prospect of it happening soon would mean you'd be waiting for that potentially tens of thousands of pounds of saved tax.
And also the old way of doing this, which previous governments have done, is to increase the threshold at which you start paying stamp duty. Because until recently, you could buy a house for £250,000 and not pay any stamp duty.
And also
that's been a sort of
dated as well, even, so if the property is valued between £150,000 and I can't remember what it is, then you pay a small percent and then it goes up and up and up. So, you could fiddle with that.
People have used other levers of stamp duty, yeah.
So I asked specifically, and again, I'm conscious we're in the realms of the sort of casting a long way down the track here. Would it be in the first King's speech, your first set of legislative ideas after election? They wouldn't bite on that. But then there is a challenge then around that, and this would be my last sort of big hypothetical thought, that if where would we be without this?
We've got to fill the rest of the
That's itself a hypothetical.
Well, no, exactly.
I mean, this episode we're doing in like 2030 by the sounds of it. It's
exactly.
really interesting.
Would be that if you do it fairly quickly, which logic would suggest you would have to, because otherwise you would tempt the very thing that you're trying to avoid, which is a kind of even more gummed up housing market, is that you would land yourself with a bill, they reckon around £9 billion, that you wouldn't instantly have the money to pay for, because a lot of it, not least the welfare cuts, they acknowledge would take time. And so what do you do in the intervening period? Anyway, I'll stop there.
Reading the Conservative press release, which obviously only journalists will do and no normal person would ever do, you realise half of that press release is actually dedicated to the fact that Rachel Reeves is not planning to increase the stamp duty thresholds in this Parliament. And so they're saying, actually, the Labour government will be clobbering more people with stamp duty over the next few years because of fiscal drag, like what has happened with the freezes in the income tax thresholds. And so actually, as much of their press release is about what we would do if we were in government in 3.5 years, as is look at what Rachel Reeves is doing to cost you more in tax in the next 3.5 years.
And it's another way of giving them something more to say in the coming months than they previously had, because when the budget comes on November the 26th, I think it is, the Conservatives, you can be sure as anything, will say, we think it's terrible that the government has done X, Y, Z, and we would instead be doing this, abolishing stamp duty. We think it is terrible that the government has not increased the stamp duty thresholds in line with inflation, but we would be abolishing it anyway. So it's just that second half of the sentence which allows them to get more sharp definition in those brief moments where they do manage, and this is still the big question, can they manage this, to punch through the political noise?
And the third half of the sentence, if you can have such a thing, is sentence inflation happening right here, right now, is how this would be paid for. And that was the other big thing that Kemi Badenoch announced in her speech, what she described as her new golden rule. And she described it like this.
We have to get the deficit down. And we must also show how every tax cut or spending increase is paid for. So today, I am introducing a new golden economic rule. Every pound we save will be put to work. At least half will go towards cutting the deficit, because living within our means is our first priority.
Now, Chris, my first thought when I heard the new golden rule was, well, first of all, golden rules is very retro, because Gordon Brown was famous for having golden rules when he was Chancellor. And the other very retro thing is talking about the deficit. Do you remember when we were younger political journalists in the 2009, 2010? The deficit was what we talked about all day, every day. The difference between what the government earns and what the government spends and the gap that they have to borrow.
Yeah, and they are determined to dust off that record and have it playing again in a way. That's a retro reference in itself, isn't
Records, vinyl, very fashionable.
Listen to me.
Go back to your old mini discs. Which we actually did use as journalists in that era.
Oh, we did. And they were, I could never
This
get
is all sailing so far over my head. I do know what a mini disc is, because that's what David Cameron recorded his memoir on. Of course, Adam.
There you go.
Yes, they were square, Henry. It was quite extraordinary. I could never get them to work.
No, very easy to delete as well.
To delete and skipping and over the, dearie me.
Let's do an old newscast about mini discs.
Yeah, about all of the...
Forget like the Maastricht Treaty or
about
the Brexit referendum.
About all of the interviews that 40-something journalists did, only to realise afterwards they'd not recorded because of a flipping mini disc. Anyway, where was I?
Back in the room.
Deficit. They're really keen to get that word back into the political conversation. Borrowing and debt, and then trying to make that big picture argument, and you heard it in the context of the money that is spent servicing the national debt versus the education budget or the defence budget or whatever, but then also conscious that gets you so far in a political conversation, but you need to ground it in what they would see as the benefits of having done that, either in tax cuts or in things that they're choosing to spend money on, like that pot that Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor, was talking about, that is ring-fenced in terms of national insurance contributions that then is handed back to people in order to buy a first home.
But Henry, just give us a way of thinking about when they say 50p in every pound will be used to pay down the deficit. Just what that actually means, because it took me a little while to actually just intellectually just sort of process it. What they really mean is, if they make a cut, say, to the benefits bill, that cut will be permanent. That's what they mean.
Exactly. They're saying they are only using half of the proceeds of the cuts on policies like stamp duty, and the other half is sort of, as you say, being absorbed to pay down the deficit. Yeah, I mean, it's quite significant. It suffers from all the caveats and all the hypotheticals that we've talked about earlier today. But I think, again, it is about stating priorities. And there is a strategic view at the top of the Conservative Party that there is a glimmer of a niche for them as the party that is willing to say, actually, we're going to cut things and bank that. We're going to, they wouldn't use the A word, they would not talk about austerity, but, of returning slightly more to the Cameron Osborne days of a leaner state doing less. And crucially, that is not just about defining themselves against the government, which on Rachel Reeves's watch, and she's very proud of this, is spending more and borrowing more, investing more, as she would put it. But actually, I think it is as much about defining themselves against a party which, unusually for a conference leader speech this year, barely got mentioned. Reform UK. Kemi Badenoch can see them moving in a slightly more statist, high-spending direction because they want to mop up some disillusioned Labour voters. And she thinks, OK, well, the path of fiscal conservatism is left clear for her.
On that, just one little point on the deficit that someone was pointing out to me last night. This is very nerdy, very, very newscasty.
Perfect.
Which is that Rachel Reeves' current plan is that by the end of the Parliament, you've actually not got a deficit on day-to-day
which is known as the current budget.
Yeah, and therefore, in theory, if she meets that, then there isn't a deficit, at least by how they define it. Now, there is a wider argument, of course, about how you define it and when what one party might regard as investment, another just sees as spending, if you like.
Which is funded by debt.
Indeed. And also, even on arriving at that, the national debt and therefore borrowing and therefore interest payments on said borrowing is significant.
Which then brings me on to an interesting thing that a few people have mentioned to me here, and I've seen written up in a few of the papers, this idea that if Keir Starmer and Shabana Mahmood do actually get legal and illegal migration down in the next few years, that's actually beneficial to the Conservatives when it comes to the next election.
I think Mel Stride actually said on a fringe, with admirable candour but perhaps political insensitivity, exactly that, which is that the Conservatives don't want immigration to be an issue come the next election, because if it is, then both Labour and Reform UK will say, well, this is a problem which developed and grew on their watch. Whereas if the next election is a much more straightforward, who's going to keep the country prosperous, who's going to make you individually better off, then the Conservatives think they'd do better. I mean, of course, there's reasons to think that they might not do better, not least Liz Truss and the spectre thereof. But yeah, I mean, that is definitely the Conservatives' hope.
One thing, just going back to reform, and Henry mentioned it just a moment ago, fascinating strategically in terms of the crafting of that speech. I'm told, by the way, she drew up her first draft towards the tail end of the summer recess, so back at the tail end of August, and then it's been sort of thrashed around since then. That, if you were a fly on the wall who had missed the last couple of years of political discussion, you would think, oh, well, there's a Conservative leader now in opposition who's making an argument against, if you like, the old political enemy of the Labour Party. Yes, there was one or two references to reform, and yes, there was an undercurrent of an argument that was trying to paint reform and Labour as being fiscally incontinent, and Conservatives, making the argument around sound money. But clearly a decision made, and we've seen it actually when Kemi Badenoch's been confronted directly with questions around Nigel Farage, that he was just not going to get much of a mention, and reform were not going to get much of a mention, and that the focus was going to be on, as they see it, the failings of the current government, which is quite something when you've got a party that is eating their poll ratings, for lunch at the moment, and is a huge contributor to them being in this unprecedentedly bleak position in the opinion polls and in the national conversation, and is the very reason, really, why the challenge for them now, and obviously they hope that what they're announcing allows this to begin to happen, is whether anything, really, of what they've said in the last few days is heard, is noticed.
I'm just looking down at your notepad, and it is quite blank.
Oh, yeah.
Which is good, because you were prepared to take lots of notes during this episode.
Yeah.
Are there other things in the other bits of the notepad from the speech that you would like to bring to our attention? For example, her saying that she would ban doctors from going on strike.
Yeah.
More funding for apprenticeships, less funding for universities.
So the doctors thing, they had said before, but again, hadn't generated much attention for all of the reasons we've just outlined. Their argument around that is that there's already folk who cannot strike. Police is a great example. Why not extend it to doctors? They argue because they point to recent strikes and the effect that they had on so many people in terms of cancelled appointments and operations and all of that. So they think that's a logical next step, and they also want to tighten up the minimum service requirements for other people within the health service. So obviously, if you fail to do that and there's a strike that extends beyond doctors, then you could still cripple the capacity of the NHS to act sort of normally or close to normally in those scenarios. I can't remember what else you said.
Anything else from you, Henry?
Can I make a really shallow contribution?
Please do, yeah.
I thought the delivery...
One of Lady Gaga's best songs, and she was here last night.
Shallow contribution?
No, Shallow.
Oh, right. So
Famous Lady Gaga song.
From,
It's not Shallow contribution.
from A Star Is Born.
Exactly.
let's talk about minidiscs again.
No, I thought her delivery was really good. And I think that matters because a lot of this conference, and certainly a lot of the build-up to this conference, was about Robert Jenrick and what threat he continues to pose to her after she beat him to the leadership 10 or 11 months ago. And I think her speech will be seen by almost everyone to have gone better in the hall and have felt more natural than Robert Jenrick.
Yeah, when you say good, what sort of things are you talking about? What sort of tools was she using?
She used laughter a lot, and it felt quite natural. She punctuated her jokes with sort of... I mean, she must have heard those jokes 1,000 times.
Self-deprecation?
Yeah,
Did
self-deprecation. And I just think we should remark on it because it is something that isn't commonly associated with Kemi Badenoch, who has, I think, understandably, given what's happened in the polls and some of the very visible political errors she's made, especially in the House of Commons, someone who's taken brickbats for her personal approach, to be honest. And a lot of the off-the-record criticism of her from Conservative MPs is very personal and about her as a person. And I thought she put her as a person and as a personality at the heart of that speech to really positive and winning effect.
And then added to that, going back to the policy stuff, you know, she's often been associated with the kind of cultural questions of our time, both from her time in government and since. And then that definitive shift this week, specifically to the economy, also to borders as well, which she focused on principally in her kind of, not warm-up speech, but the one that got the conference going back on Sunday. And that's why there was a definite tilt towards the economic stuff today. But shifting herself and her leadership and the Conservative brand under her leadership onto that sort of, if you like, more traditional and broader territory than some of the stuff she's often been associated with.
And also, it was such a contrast with Robert Jenrick's speech because his was quite jokey, quite gimmicky. Like he held up a judge's wig at one point. He was talking about 4 Tory blondes, and it ended up being people who'd been on reality shows and not done very well. It was just so different from what he was trying to do yesterday. Henry, one of the other things she mentioned was this alleged Chinese spying case at Westminster, which is a bit of a tangled tale. And this was 2 people who worked in Parliament who had been charged with spying for an enemy, China, and then the case was dropped a few days ago, and it's all to do with the Crown Prosecution Service saying that the government hadn't provided the goods as far as they were concerned to help them proceed with the prosecution.
And they deny all the allegations.
Yes.
It's extremely tangled, this. So the 2 men concerned, Christopher Cash and Christopher Berry, it's a tale of 2 Chris's and a tale of 2 DPPs, Directors of Public Prosecution. So the 2 Chris's, Cash and Berry, were charged with spying for China back in April 2024. And the trial was meant to begin this week, and then, as you say, a couple of weeks ago it collapsed. Because the Crown Prosecution Service, which brings these prosecutions on behalf of the state, said, we can't bring this prosecution. And understandably, a lot of MPs were saying, well, what on earth has happened here? Not least because one of these men who was charged and who denies ever having done anything wrong worked in Parliament, so had access to the parliamentary estate and so on. Now, we found out yesterday, courtesy of one of the DPPs, Stephen Parkinson, the current Director of Public Prosecutions, his account of why it collapsed. He wrote a letter to MPs where he said the issue was for there to be any realistic chance of conviction, which is the test for these things, the government, a representative of the government, would have had to be willing to say in court that China is an enemy. China poses a threat to the UK. And he said the government made clear that it was not willing to do so, even though he repeatedly asked them to do so. Enter the other Director of Public Prosecutions, Keir Starmer, who did the job before he came into Parliament. He says, no, that's not right. That's actually not the test. The only question that bites here is how China was considered by the government during the period of the alleged offences, 2022 to 2023. And at that point, the Conservative government did not formally classify them as a threat, and therefore that's why he says the CPS dropped the case. They can't both be right, really, but it's a big political controversy as well as a sort of technical legal question, because meanwhile, the UK government under Keir Starmer is warming up its relationship with China. They insist that that's completely disconnected from what's happened here, but Kemi Badenoch, certainly for one, does not believe them.
Today we learn Today we learn that Labour deliberately collapsed the trial of 2 men accused of spying on MPs for China because the Prime Minister wants to suck up to Beijing. This is squalid.
The kind of details around all of this have been, I think, or the public debate around all of this since the weekend has been artificially slowed by the fact we're in conference season.
Yes.
Parliament isn't sitting, and so there hasn't been what would have been, I suspect, an instant, i.e. on Monday morning, request for an urgent question or a statement or a demand that the Attorney General came before the House of Lords, because there's so many questions that are still outstanding around all of this. But the core of it is, what is our posture towards China? And it's a sort of unavoidable conundrum of the mid-2020s, this growing leviathan of economic and geopolitical heft that has a completely different worldview from our own, where there are challenges in terms of espionage and all the rest of it that governments, current and previous, have acknowledged, but where they are very careful with their language, because if you start saying in court or anywhere else that China is an enemy, or whatever language you attach to it, that can have consequences. The clear pitch from the current government has been trying to warm things up. So the new business secretary was out there just the other week in what was publicly described as reopening trade talks for the first time in 7 years. The Chancellor's been there. The former Foreign Secretary, now Deputy Prime Minister David Lammy, has been there. Jonathan Powell, the National Security Advisor, has been there. There's been talk in the ether for a while that at some point maybe the Prime Minister heads out to China. And clearly, economically, a relationship with China is unavoidable. But then you get into this delicate dance around how you approach this kind of stuff. I remember for umpteen times asking both the previous Prime Minister and the current one on various trips, how do you describe China? Do you describe it as a threat? And there's a sort of quick shuffle of the notepaper. No, it's an epoch-defining challenge, or they're trying to use tough language, but short of something that they perceive to be basically too tough in the context of the swirl of everything else that they're trying to prioritise. There's loads more to come, though, on the specifics of this.
Well, and also to then bring in a third former Director of Public Prosecutions, Lord MacDonald, Ken MacDonald, was on the radio this morning on the Today programme saying actually in his experience in lots of cases, when people see a conspiracy, actually it's just a cock-up. Well, and it's mistakes being made all throughout the process.
And that was also the position of Dominic Grieve, the former Attorney General, who was essentially saying it seems like they've got in a complete muddle here, and how could they not have worked out back in April 2024 when they charged what the government was and was not willing to say. The government is adamant that what they were willing to say in court did not change at any point during this process. But a lot of people are sceptical of that, and I think parliamentary accountability is about to enter the picture because Parliament is going to be back, and I think things will come to a head one way or another.
Including an appearance in front of MPs by Jonathan Powell, the National Security Advisor.
Well, yes, although is an appearance that takes place in private tantamount to an appearance for the purposes of public accountability? No, I mean, sorry, I'm not quibbling with the word, but I think, actually...
No offence taken, don't worry.
No, but I think...
it's sort of tree falling in woods territory.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's getting harder and harder for that appearance to take place in private with every drip of revelations or questions, or the thing that really struck me of the various esteemed voices on various bits of BBC output today talking about this was basically no one could quite work out why on earth this had happened. And if really clever, really experienced people can't offer up a simple explanation, sure, it may well prove to be cock-up, but I think the onus is on the government to demonstrate that it was a cock-up, or the CPS to demonstrate that it was a cock-up, or whatever. And I really hope we can say cock-up on YouTube and BBC Sounds, otherwise that last sentence was a bit pointless.
No sense. No, I think we can say cock-up, I think so. It's all about the context of the word, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, I suppose so, yeah.
Right, I think that's it for this episode, which has had so many trolleys going backwards and forwards. And if you're watching it on YouTube, because you can now watch every episode of Newscast on YouTube, you will have seen lots of other daily news podcasters. Anne McElvoy from Politico walked past.
Oh, really?
And I noticed, thank you, Anne, for lowering your voice as you walked past, one podcaster to another. And then I saw Beth Wrigley from Sky, host of Electoral Dysfunction.
Did Beth lower her voice?
She was over
I can't believe that.
She was a bit further away.
Oh, right, okay.
The producers of the newsagents walked past cast, by the way, even if not the performers.
Coming to see how it's done.
Almost like there's more podcasters here than Conservative Party activists. Because that's the other thing.
Well, he's still here, because they've all gone.
Yeah, true. 'Cause, I mean, everyone packs up very quick. Oh, this is just this other thing that I can't quite sort of shake from this conference, is that you can never tell the people who haven't come.
No. But then
Like, there might be like real enemies of Kemi Badenoch who've got very different views about what should be happening, who aren't here. And that comes back to the thing I was saying right at the start about how hard the CCHQ, the Conservative Party, had worked in this speech to make sure that when she left the hall, which was a much smaller hall than these things would usually be in, she was flanked by adoring activists chanting her name and holding up big signs saying, Conservative Party, we love you. It's like they had to put quite a lot of effort in to make that look good.
One final thought, which is bordering on the trivial, but gets to the sort of choreography and the stagecraft that I think Kemi Badenoch and her team did pull off today, was that when she built up to the big reveal about stamp duty, there was a pantomime-esque moment. Because I was stood next to a senior figure close to her, and again there was that, ooh, but it was for those of us just observing it, it just brought a smile, really, because of that genuine sort of sense of, ooh, what is this? And as trivial as that sort of thing sounds, it does matter, because if you're an activist who's taken time off work and come to Manchester at considerable expense and had a good few days in the company of people you like to chat to about political ideas, that kind of theatre and that kind of moment matters, particularly if you feel like you're hearing it first from her as opposed to from one of us in advance because it's been briefed or it's leaked or whatever.
Yes, right, that's it for this episode of Newscast from Conservative Party Conference. Thank you very much for listening and for watching, and we will be back with another one very soon. Bye-bye.
Party conference season's not over, you know.
No, I know. I didn't say that, though.
No, I know.
Because people often make that mistake going, that's the end of it. You're like, no, Plaid Cymru, for example.
Scottish National Party.
Scottish National Party.
Heading there on
Well, it is
Saturday.
over for me. Goodbye.